It's a pleasure to be here this evening and talk to you about John Thomson. He was one of the great Victorian photographers, but he was so much more. He was a writer, he taught photography, an instructor of photography, he was a translator, and he did much to explain China, really, to a Victorian audience with his books. And so I'm going to hopefully show you some of those images that he took when he was in China for 4 years. It's really important. It was in 1868. It was just 4 years from 1868 to 1872, but it was just as China was modernizing. So sometimes what he was photographing hadn't changed for 2,000 years. And so his images are very special. So to begin with, I'm going to explain a little bit about the images you're going to see. So the images I'm showing have come sort of mainly from 3 sources. They're from his own publications, from international collections, and also from the negatives which he created, which are in the Wellcome Institute, or the Wellcome Collection. The image on the left is one of the few images of John Thomson himself, and it's on one of his negatives, and it was a stereo negative. It's just half of a stereo negative. And it looks very black and white because it's one of these negatives. It's very black and white. I'm going to talk a bit about Fu Chao in the River Min because this is one of the first books he produced, which there was only 46 copies. He produced this when he got back to England, and it contains images which he selected, which he thought were really beautiful, and I'm going to be showing you those. His printing technique is really important because he decides that he's going to persevere with a printing technique where his images don't fade, because at that time, silver images, there was a big problem with fading. And so he talks about this here, that he's adopted this new process. And they look kind of chocolatey, but they replicate what a normal photograph at that time would have looked like. So this is the island pagoda at the mouth of the River Min. It's a really beautiful image, and it would have been a whole page image in Fu Chao in the River Min. To explain a little bit about his negatives, that his negatives have an amazing quality. So he quite often composed his subjects so that there was quite a lot of space around them, so he could come and crop them later. And this is the negative that comes from. It's a stereo negative. And you'll see there's a cross on the left-hand side. And he's put that cross on there when he developed it. And he's looked at those negatives and he's decided that the one on the right is the one he wants his printers to print from. You'll see there's a strip of paper down the side, and it's got a title, and it's got Canton Ladies, and it's also got a number. And that was put on in 1920 when he was trying to sell his negatives. So he doesn't number them until he's about to sell them. And he makes an inventory of all his negatives at that point and a list. The number below is the Wellcome Collection's number. That 19604 is a Wellcome number. And so the total size would be of that negative would be about 10 centimeters by 20 centimeters. And so this is the crop that he did for that image. And this is how it appeared in Fu Chao in the River Min. So he cropped it like that, and it appeared as quite a small image on the page, as 1 of 4. But what's really beautiful, and I've put a grid over the image so you can see the quality of it. He would be amazed at how we can scan his negatives and enlarge them. So that image comes from just a tiny bit of the negative. It's only 3 by 4 centimeters. But those women look so real, and they look like they could step off the page, really. you know, and they don't look like they were taken in 1868 or 1869. And when you look at them on screen, and you can do this because anyone could go to the Wellcome Institute, you can look at these images and download them, you can search for all sorts of images if you're interested in China. When you look at them on screen, you can actually see the threads in their garments and the details of the stitching. So it's just so amazing what you can do with Photoshop, and the Wellcome Institute has scanned these negatives to a very high degree. There are some damage somewhere between when John Thomson gave them to the Wellcome. He didn't really give them, but they arrived at the Wellcome with the Wellcome curators. They were in storage somewhere and they got damaged. And so but I haven't taken out the damage. I've left it so you can see it as it is. And an image like this, John Thomson would have probably taken it to show what the street traders were like. If you're getting up in the morning, you would probably be greeted by people who'd want to take you somewhere in a chair, or they'd be trying to sell you something. But the thing I like about it is it's got all this detail at the top of what's on the balcony and what's growing. And it's sort of, that was an incidental bit of the composition that he didn't really think that we'd be interested in. But if you go through the negatives, there's lots of things like that. And so this is Foochow Bridge, and he's taken this from a boat, and sometimes he takes lots of things from boats because I think nobody can attack him in the boat. So people were always staring at him, and Europeans were not popular. They really were not popular at that point. With a lot of the normal people were not very happy about the Europeans, and they thought of them as aliens, really. They're invading their space. But you can see this beautiful, the detail is so great that you can see the beautiful sort of detail of the straw and the boats behind, and that looks like that's a European building, but they were probably trading tea in it because Foochow had a lot of trading of tea. So why did his negatives end up with Sir Henry Wellcome? Well, when John Thomson was trying to find a home for his negatives, he was 80, and he tried several places to find a home. One of them was the Royal Geographical Society that didn't want them. He tried to sort of wind his businesses up, and he was renting space where these negatives were stored. He does things like he resigns from some of the clubs he belongs to, like the Royal Geographical Society, and then they suddenly realize he's still a member, and then they make him a life member. So he's been paying his subs for 50 years, and then they suddenly decide. But anyway, the reason why I think they ended up with the Wellcome is because of this. So Henry Wellcome started to actively collect things which he could put into a museum for medicine in 1903. But he was also known to be very interested in geography. And the medical museum actually opens in 1914. But he's collecting for a long time, and people know that he's buying things. And he buys anything to do with medicine connected to anywhere in the world. And so people at the Royal Geographical Society would have been aware that he was collecting things, and explorers would have known this. But he funds an archaeological excavation in Sudan. And he does this because he's interested in the country. He wants to help people. He won't just give people money, but he thinks if he does something like an excavation or a dig, it will help them. They'll get paid to do the excavation work. And he uses photography. It's unusual in that he uses photography, and I'll just go forward. He actually takes aerial photographs of the site. This is before the First World War, using a box kite, which is sort of quite amazing, really. And perhaps Thomson knew that he had this interest in photography and using it in exploration. But the other thing is that he gives £1,000. This is Sir Henry Wellcome gives £1,000 to the Royal Geographical Society in 1913, when they're buying their new building. All sorts of people give money to the RGS. I don't know why they did that, but they did. The Canadian government gave them £1,000 as well to help them purchase the building, which is sort of seems odd. But he was known to be interested and a supporter of the society. And because John Thomson was an instructor for the Royal Geographical Society, I think he may have thought that this was, you know, they'd be interested. And then there's this plan in 1920 to exhibit photographs. So he contacts the curators. And he writes this letter and he says, if Mr. Wellcome intends to have a room in the museum set apart for the exhibition photographs, selections from photographs taken by me during my Eastern travels would prove useful. And the next day they write back and say, should be very pleased to have your negatives to exhibit. You know, it's very positive, and together with suitable notes by yourself. And this is the big headache. He has to start actually numbering and, you know, going back over this 1,000 negatives. The negatives covered Siam, Cochin, which is sort of Vietnam, China, Cambodia, the Isle of Formosa, and Cyprus. And this map comes from the book that he published in 1875, which was aimed at, it cost a guinea. It was supposed to be his cheap version of a book he did of China, illustrations of China. It shows where he traveled in the East. He's asked to value the collection, and the collection gets moved from his offices that he's been renting, that he has to get out of. It gets moved to the curators, and they insure it. He says it should be insured for £500. And seeing that the negatives have travelled safely halfway around the world, he thinks they should be. And there were over 1,000 negatives. These are two of the boxes they were in. And there was also prints, and there were written lists. But the written lists seem to have disappeared. And the prints don't seem to be in the collection. Whether something happened, I don't know. It's very hard to know, really. But the negotiations stall, and John Thomson becomes very anxious in the following year when still nothing has happened. They're still sort of debating what they're going to pay for it, how much they're going to take. And he makes the point, which is really important, I think, that a lot of the negatives haven't been published, and also the Chinese section has unique historical interest of picturing a collection of the country and its rulers prior to the collapse of the empire. So they're all taken before China had changed. I think I just ought to give you a bit of background about John Thomson himself. He was Scottish. He made his name, really. He studied with someone called Bryson in Edinburgh, and he was an apprentice. He learned how to make lenses. He was an optician. He went to night school. He was very studious, and he was very bright, and he won prizes for his English. When he's 26, he decides he's going to join his brother abroad, who's in Singapore, but he must have had the idea that he was going to do photography. And after some periods of working in a place called the Straits and working in various places, he comes back via Siam, and he comes back via Cambodia and photographs Angkor Wat. And these photographs he comes back with astonish people, because the Royal Geographical Society at this stage are saying, look, if you're going somewhere hot, if you're going to Africa, just don't bother to take a camera. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible to get a good result. The chemicals are affected by the heat. It'll be a disaster. And here's John Thomson. He's come back and he's got these brilliant images. And they astound people, and so he exhibits them at there's the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1866, and it's in Nottingham, and he exhibits his photography, and he also gives a talk about what he saw, and he's exhibiting alongside the great photographers of the day, Rylander and Robinson. The BJP are so impressed with his images of children in Siam and dancers in Siam, they ask him to do a series of articles, and he does this series of articles. And it's practical, you can see practical photography in tropical regions. And he does 6 articles. And some of the advice is very simple. It's like, know your equipment before you go, but take your images the first 2 hours of the morning and then don't bother. And be very clean about everything. Just be very clean. He writes it in a much more technical language, of course, but it's very practical. And the stereo camera, the plan there, which you can see, is of his stereo camera that he made. He says, I made a stereo camera, and helpfully supplies a little plan of it. But he gives very practical advice about when and where, and the actual chemistry that you need, how you need to address the chemistry so that it'll work in a hot climate. And so these are some more images of Siam and the children in Siam, and nobody can understand why they're so clear. And because they're you can see this is broken negative, and there's his name, actually, I don't think you can see it, but his name is down there. He's put his name, John Thomson, it's down there. But they're very, they're showing a place which is completely foreign to the Victorian who's seeing it for the first time. Would people have seen it like this? Probably. If you had, he used to give lantern slide presentations, and they were from his negatives. He'd make these lantern slides, and they probably would have looked similar to that, I think. There's another one. But I think everything changed. When he was in '66, he wasn't planning to go back east, but he met a girl and fell in love. And if he was going to make money, and her family were quite wealthy, then he was going to have to go back to the Far East, and she was going to join him. And so there's John Thomson there, and that's his fiancée at that point, Isabel. And this is a picture of them on their honeymoon. And see, the cat has moved. There was a cat in the picture. She travels out in '68 to join him and marries him in Hong Kong, or Canton. I think that might be Canton where that picture's taken. He bases himself in Hong Kong, and then goes out from there to do trips, to take pictures. And he will be producing photography for other Europeans that are there. So that he might be doing portrait work, or he might be selling them pictures of around Hong Kong, or views that he's taken, so that people will be collecting photographs to put into albums to take home to show people what life was like, really, where they've been. And this is for, I'm very sorry, but I've forgotten the name of the prince it is. Is it Prince Alfred, or someone who goes to Hong Kong in '68, and all the flags are out for him. And so Hong Kong's decorated with flags because one of the princes is going there on tour. So I thought what would be good would be to go on a shoot with you. We'll go on a shoot with John Thomson to the River Min and have a look at some of his images, because that seems like quite a good thing to do. John Thomson and another person called Justice Doolittle, who was the editor of the Chinese Recorder and the Missionary Journal, were invited on a trip to go up the River Min, by some European businessmen who had 2 yachts. And this was something that you could do in the winter months. You could do it in December. You couldn't do it in the spring because the summer melt, there would be too much water in the river. So you would do it in the colder times when the river was really low. There were lots of places to go and visit. It was places like Lover's Leap, which John Thomson's taking this picture of because people will be wanting to buy it. It's really good. Mr. Doolittle says that he describes Thomson as an artist, and he also says he took 50 or 60 photographs. Some of them were stereoscopic. And quite often John Thomson will pose a person in the view, so you can see the scale of the landscape. And this was something that was common with lots of Victorian photographers, like Samuel Bourne in India. He would always have someone very beautifully arranged within the landscape, so you could see how big the landscape was. And this is just before these rapids. And they're going to a monastery, and it's on a tributary off of the Min. And to get to it, you have to go over rapids, and you would transfer from your yacht, which you're very comfortable in, to a little native river boat. And what's interesting is there's a line of houses there. This is the difference between when the spring melt comes and now. So you have these rivers with huge differences in the amount of water that flows through them. And this makes it very difficult for moving things around, like goods, crops like tea and things like this. But it means that if you're going to try and go up those rivers, you do it in the winter months. And it can be quite treacherous, really treacherous. So when you hire your boat, there would be trackers would be hired with them, and they would drag the boat through the shallows, avoiding the rapids, but they would drag it up the river, over the difficult areas of the rapids. Trackers had a terrible life. Really, they're always wet, they're always cold. John Thomson really admired them, and his pupil, Isabella Bird, really admired them as well, because you would get to know them. You'd be in the boat with them. You'd on the good bits, they'd be in the boat with you. So you'd all be sort of eating together, cheek by jowl, really. And then when you got to the difficult bits, everybody would be out, and they would be dragging the boat up the river. And it didn't always work. And so this is wrecks. This is a photo of a wreck on the River Min. I've included 4 images from the Met in New York, which were thought to be by John Thomson, but we don't think they are. We think they're by a Chinese photographer called Lai Feng. And I've included them because it would have been like this on that trip John Thomson was on. The Europeans really, it's unbelievable really, because they treat it like a pleasure ground, and it's written about, these areas are written about, this is a great place to go and see, and it's wonderful. You can botanize, you can collect plants and things like this. And so this image shows a group of Europeans, and I've named who they are. They're from different banks and things like that. They've all got chairs with them that they've brought on the yacht. Somehow they've got their chairs with them. John Thomson also hires a chair, which is a tiny little chair, and then they ascend this mountain to go up to this monastery. And this is a place called Banker's Glen, and it's one of the places you would go, and you'll find it's sort of odd. There's this beautiful scenery, and then there's all these Europeans sort of sat in amongst it on the rocks. It was really difficult ascent, and you would have to go through what was described as a natural tunnel, because you had to pass through a mountain, and you'd go through the rocks, small steps. And on the other side, Thomson describes it like you go through this terrible dark tunnel. When you come out on the other side, it's just like a lush, green, almost tropical environment, although you've come from one area where it's winter and it's into this very protected area. And this is where the monastery was. And he says it was like nothing. It was like nothing I've ever seen or dreamt of seeing. And I succeeded in taking an excellent picture of the curious building. And he describes how one of the monks had to ascend a tree and chop off some branches. This sounds like photographers today, actually. That got in the way. So, Anyway, he's so impressed with it, he decides he's going to stay. His friends are going to return, and they want to go back to Fuchao to get their mail. It's like email really today, isn't it? But they want to go back and pick up their mail, and they promise they will come back and pick him up. So he goes down, gets his supplies, and his bearers bring it back up, all his camera equipment, and he stays and he does this shoot. And what is amazing is he actually photographs the monks at pray, how they lived, and the place. There's a big cross across this negative, which has been scanned. And I suspect it's because the one that was perfect's been damaged. But who knows? It might be somewhere and they just didn't actually scan it. I've got to find out what happened to it. But here are the 3 Buddhist monks that live at that monastery. And he said, I was furnished with a bedroom with a veranda which had magnificent views. And I didn't sleep much. It was photography on my brain. It was a relief to get up in the morning. It was so cold, I think it was a relief to get up in the morning and have a good look at the symmetry of the great bell close to my veranda. And they were also ringing it as well. So I think he wanted to get up because he had to get up. And of course, he would take a picture of the bell being hit. And here's another view of the monastery looking out over, and it looks precarious how it's perched on the rock. It is actually still there, believe it or not, but it's too dangerous to get to. But it's still in existence. And it's perched within a cave. And what I like is the detail that he goes into, and you see the detail of them chanting and what they're wearing, and it's just very, very sort of beautiful, really. And if you go into that, there's all sorts of things in that image. And he photographed this incense box, which he called a time box. And each incense stick lasted for 12 hours. So he said you could go at any time to the box and check what time it was, depending on how far the incense stick had burnt down. And apparently, Chinese people used that for navigation. And early navigation, they knew that 12 hours lasted the length of that incense stick. And so if you wanted to go somewhere like we would use a timepiece in Georgian, they started to use timepieces. The Chinese were ahead of us, really, with incense sticks for measuring time. So I think I want to talk a bit about the equipment. It's always helpful to have a photograph. And this image actually helps us. We know quite a lot about how he worked because of these articles he wrote, Practical Photography in Tropical Regions. And he also translated a French book, a History and Handbook of Photography by Gaston Tissandier. And that is a great book because he's the editor, he just translated it. He can't resist putting in information. It's a great book to read, it's really good. But in this photograph, there's some details. And that's his equipment. And underneath that, it says, Dr. Michael Pritchard very kindly explained to me what the equipment was. He sat in the audience, I'm so sorry. So anyway, this is what Michael suggested it would be. So this is his collodion plates in the drying rack. There's a chemical chest, or it could be containing a container for a camera. Here's his larger camera. That's the lens, and that's the focusing screen. Is that right at the back? Yeah? And Michael said it looks like it's 10-12 or 10-8. Well, the negatives, the large negatives in the welcome are all 10-12. There are a few smaller, but majority are all 10-12. This is a dark box for processing, for those things you have to do that are light sensitive. And there was a barrel there as well. So thank you, Dr. Michael Pritchard. It's very kind of you to go through that. And the other thing that was really important to him was his assistants. So all the time he was in the Far East, he had assistants. And he had them when he was in Singapore, the first time he was there. And, oh dear, I've got a thing. Does anyone know what restart? Do I need to do anything? Do I need to? Yeah. Remind me later. Do I need to? Hey, hooray. He had 2 assistants. And we for a long time, when I was working at the RPS, when they said, oh, he had 2 assistants. And he talks about them in his books. the assistants. Everyone thought it was these two gentlemen here, but they're too young, really. They were with him in Singapore, and when he comes back to Hong Kong, he finds them again, and they work with him again in his studio. And so if John Thomson is creating the negatives, he will probably be using them to help print. He's probably trained them to print. They had so much skill, they were worth finding again to work with. They tried to run away from him once, but he got them back. And I don't know whether this is them, but I think it might be. All this negative had on it was saved from the wreck, and there does seem to be some photographic equipment in it. And both, it happened to Isabella Bird. She got tipped out of a boat on rapids at one point, and these seem to be the right age. It might not be them, but it would be great if it was. But they were called Hakum and Hung, and they would have printed and helped, and they made his business easy. They would have helped carry his equipment. They would have known how to set it up. You know, they would have been invaluable to him. And it's quite interesting when things come up for sale, like prints that come up and they're John Thomson, they're worth a lot of money. Probably they were printed by these guys. He created the negative, but perhaps his assistants printed them. You know, it's an interesting sort of thing. What he's trying to do when he comes back and he produces these books on China full of illustrations, he's trying to say to people, we're all in the same family, really. These are the human family which peoples the vast area of China. They're the same as you and me, which wasn't always how people were seen around the world in, you know, sort of empire proud Great Britain. So the big book, the one that's worth a lot of money for sales that comes out in 73, 74, you would pay 3 guineas for 1 volume, so 12 guineas for the set of 4. And they have these beautiful images and text in them. It's interesting because he lays it out as if it's a journey, and it helps the reader actually navigate China, because it makes sense that you follow the coastline and go around. And it's how I've been travelled around, but in actual fact, the images were taken over at different times. They weren't taken in that journey. It wasn't a continuous journey. He takes lots of pictures of people doing their jobs, like costermongers. And I've just gone back to the census for 1861, and John Thomson's there. He's an optician, he's 23, and they live in that building. And the thing about it is, as well as his family living in that building, there's 77 other people living in that building. Because most of the accommodation in Scotland at that time, it was tenement buildings, and it was people lived sort of in quite tight circumstances. They all shared the same doorway, you know, so you've got shirt makers, a mangler, I don't know what mangler, I presume that's something to do with laundry. You've got all kinds of shop women, you've got all kinds of people living in that building with him. And so to me, it seems quite sensible that he would take pictures of the people that made life possible in China, you know, sort of made it possible. Enamelers, he talks in the book about enamelers. There are not very many enamelers because it's a very skilled operation. I wonder whether he set it up outside so he could photograph it. And normally this activity would be taking place indoors. I'm not sure about that. I don't know if that's right or not. But they're enamelers, and they were producing things for the Europeans to take home. It's just everyday sort of common pictures, really. He also took the great and the good, and he's one of the few people who had a poem written about him by the people who he was photographing. And this appeared in a great book written by Sarah Stevenson and A.D. Morrison Lowe on the first 30 years of Scottish photography. And of course, John Thomson features in it. And they in their research, came across a poem written about him, and they managed to get it translated. And it talks about the visitor from overseas, with his piercing eyes, whiskers like a dragon, and a great forehead. And he did seem to have a great forehead. And uses a lens to capture a man's life. You know, there are lots of European photographers there, but very few of them seemed to integrate with people like he did. He takes pictures of the Bronze Temple, and this was destroyed really. Well, it wasn't destroyed. This is one of the few things that remains because it is actually a bronze temple. It appears in illustrations of China and its people, and it's almost like it's there and it's saying, this is the damage we did. This is the damage we did in when we went to China and held them up in 1860. You know, it appears within the book. He makes friends with a Mr. Yang, who is quite wealthy and is interested in photography and is a photographer, and he helps him with his chemistry. And he's introduced to Mr. Yang by other photographers, Thomas Church, there's other photographers who are there in the area, in Peking. And this friendship gives John Thomson this wonderful opportunity to photograph women, which normally would have very closed lives. So this is why you've got this very beautiful photography. In the book, this 10 years adventures in a residence abroad, which cost just 1 guinea, the images are reproduced as woodcuts. But the wives of Mr. Yang, who had more than one wife, are very beautifully photographed and how they lived as a group. And he sets up a sort of studio in the garden, and very beautiful sort of images with all the sort of detail of the clothing. I think she moves her head and they're laughing, really, they're laughing about it. And there's also, this is how it appeared in illustrations of China and its people. But the detail of the headdress, the details of the clothes, this would be something that would impress people, I think, to see how beautiful it was. And they look, this is a bride, but it's just a very beautiful, beautiful image. Well, I'm sort of going to finish with something that happened last year, which was the blue plaque, which was put on his home in Effra Road, Brixton. And last year, English Heritage sort of recognised John Thomson, which was wonderful. But it was very much from, oh no, come back, come back. It was very much with the help of Jamie Carstairs, who's in the audience, a member of the John Thomson commemorative group, Betty Yao, who's there, who has had exhibitions all over the world of John Thomson's work taken from the negatives in the Wellcome Institute. Terry Bennett, who's written books on Chinese photography, and if you're interested, they're just so good, and Jeff Harris from Amateur Photographer. And it was just a very good thing to get his work recognised. So if you're interested, when I was working at the Royal Photographic Society, the books we'd recommend would be A Window on the Orient by Stephen White and Richard Overton, who did this beautiful book in 1997. And both of them are still like the best books, really, that you need. If you're interested in John Thomson, you should read those. Terry Bennett's series, he's got three books in his series on Chinese photography, is absolutely amazing. If you're interested in China, it's just really interesting to delve into those books and to really find out about why the Scottish photography was so much better than perhaps a lot of people elsewhere. That book really explains it. The first 30 years explains why the Scots were so ahead with photography. There's some websites that are really good. The Welcome Collection, you can just go on and you can just search it, but be careful because all sorts of things pop up, and they literally do. They'll pop up on the Welcome website. It can be, you can ask for something that seems quite innocent, and all sorts of things will come up. So a bit of caution, really, when you're using it. But the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have got all of John Thomson's illustrations of China book online, and you can look at those. And they also do a course, which is free. You can just do it, dip in and dip out of it, on cultures, visualizing cultures. And it has lots of information about different photographers, and sort of like opens up your mind to what colonial photography was about. What were these people doing over there? Were they making a fortune? Were they selling it to other Europeans? Were the Chinese buying it? You know, it's a really interesting thing to do if you're interested in that. Well, I think I'm a little bit short on time. I'm sorry about that. I'm sort of run through it very quickly, but I hope that has been helpful and interesting, and you've enjoyed that sort of brief look at John Thomson. So I'll leave it there. Is that all right? Shall I? Thank you. Anybody's got any questions? Anyone got any questions? Yes?
You said the monastery is still there. Are there still monks living in it, even though you can't go there?
No, I don't think they are.
Do they still have monasteries in China? I mean,
I think they do. Yeah. It's very strange. I think there is, for things like Buddhism, I think they are sort of, there's a sort of easing off of the restrictions that were there, but it's not for everybody.
Because there was something on TV some years ago, I think the 80s, and it was young people were gathering herbs for a monastery. Weren't quite sure whether these young people were boys or girls. Little pigtails and the typical jacket like that, and the thick soled shoes and white stockings, and that was in the 80s. I'm not sure they were boys or girls, but they were gathering herbs.
There's lots of Buddhist shrines that are still there that you can go and see. So, yeah. No, that's good. Yeah. Oh, hello, Michael.
Could you then pass it along? You mentioned briefly Isabella Bird
as
a pupil of his.
Yeah.
When was she a pupil? Was it before she did her Chinese trips, or?
Yeah, she was already famous and she was well known as a writer for her books on the Rocky Mountains, and you know, she did it in her later years. She was 60. She was 60. You know, she's in her 60s, and it was suggested to her that there's a big problem if you're a woman writer at that time, because the editors always know best. They always know best. So her book on Japan, she describes Mount Fuji, and someone at John Murray's has seen a picture of a mountain, a volcano, and it just happens to be the wrong volcano. And so they put the wrong volcano in the book, and it doesn't look anything like Mount Fuji. And she sort of, from that incident, and Murray's have to put an apology under the picture. I'm very sorry. Usually it looks like a fan. Doesn't normally look like this. So it suggested to her that the best thing would be if she actually took her own pictures. And so she's really a writer. She suddenly discovers when she starts photography, she loves it. And it's like the best thing for her, because she can take pictures, and up until that point, she has to do sketching, which she's not very good at. And, you know, she has to rely on, if she's going somewhere no one else has been, how can they write, you know, how can they draw it? How can they, if she takes a photograph, then she's got to do her own photography, really. And she's very revealing about China. I mean, it's really worth reading what she says about China. The things she says about China don't appear anywhere else, really. It's about how every village was different. And these Chinese these beautiful temples that were made of porcelain and very bright, and they would be different from village to village, about how offensive the Chinese found the European dress. You know, they didn't like tight dress close to the body. They thought it was really offensive. You know, she is really, yeah, good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You said that John Thomson was an instructor at the RGS.
Yes.
I just wondered how important and how significant he was in terms of what he was doing there.
Well, that's a really good question, because when he starts giving instruction, that some of the things he's doing is he's giving advice to really competent photographers on how they can get their work published. But a lot of the time he would assess people that would come who are going to go traveling, assess their abilities, and then find a way of actually helping them. So either getting them to go on courses, getting them to understand they really needed to know how to handle a camera before they go. He's actually credited by, so he becomes an instructor in '86 for them, and by 1900 it's acknowledged that the standard of expedition photography has greatly improved, and it's also greatly improved on being put into books. So, but there's also this other shift that he's responsible for, but he doesn't get recognized really today. By the time that Scott is going to Antarctica and Shackleton is going to Antarctica, they take professional photographers with them. So you haven't got someone who's been given this because they haven't got anything else to do. It's a professional photographer because they realize you have to tell a proper story if it's an expedition. So Hurley for Shackleton and Ponting for Scott. You know, that was trying to get that across to people, that someone in the team should be responsible for recording it. It's really what Thomson was, his influence was there, really. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah.
Hello, I'm just a casual photographer.
Oh, good.
And so I know very little about the technical aspects of this, but I was fascinated by the equipment,
Yeah.
which seemed very cumbersome, obviously. And these negatives you referred to, what were they? Were they glass plates?
They were glass, yeah.
Yes, so they were really very
Heavy.
delicate in some ways and heavy, and
Yeah.
were many broken? I mean, did they survive well?
In that image, there was a box. So you would have a box that you would slide them into and carry them like that. And he would have loads of people carrying stuff for him. There'll be people employed just to carry things. And it was the same with Isabella Bird. She employed a lot of people to carry her equipment. But you don't ever see that in an image. You have no idea of all the people that are involved in actually doing that. And he would have had to have taken the chemicals to actually make that happen. He talks about the brilliance of the invention of the dry plate. Dr. Michael Pritchard could tell you a little bit about the dry plate. But when that happens, when he goes to Cyprus, which is much later, the technology has changed and you're using dry plate. So he's not taking all the glass negatives. But those negatives are also at the Wellcome. And really, it would be really interesting to look at all of his negatives at the Wellcome, really, and how they changed over time. It would tell you a lot, because those have survived. Yeah, but it was a very... He also, the other thing that I didn't really get across, that I should have got across, was he invested in those negatives. He didn't use cheap glass. You know, he had used expensive glass. He says in one of his things, he says, you must use expensive glass. Don't think you can scrub it off and then treat it again. It's got to be absolutely clean. You know, just use the really best you can afford. And things, very sort of practical things, like you needed frames, wooden frames for the negatives, for handling them. And they'd always get broken, you know. talks very practically about having spares and things like that. Those articles are really worth reading, you know, because he's sort of obviously hugely, you know, planning for every eventuality, really, things that could go wrong. I'm not the best technical person to talk about all this stuff, really, but I've got Michael.
Probably worth mentioning that he was using the collodion process.
Yes, so yes, the collodion process. So you would be coating a glass negative and moving it around, which is why probably he gets a better result with the smaller negatives, because it's easier to get a more even finish than the larger plates if it's out in the field. Do you think? Perhaps? Yeah.
You said at the beginning that this was a time of massive change in China.
Yeah, it was.
How much of that comes through his photography and in what ways?
Well, he does take pictures of, there are negatives, he does take pictures of the arsenals where you'll find that there will be something like Sheffield on a piece of equipment where they're making bits of gun or something like that. There'll be a picture of an arsenal somewhere. So you'll sometimes see pictures of things, and there's obviously European equipment there. The buildings on the sides of the waterfronts where they're actually trying to import and export and bring tea in, or you know, to take tea out and things like that. There's lots of European building which happens very fast between 1860 and then onwards. So, but then there are bits that don't change. And there are bits when Isabella Bird goes back 20 years later and she's in more rural areas and it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. So she gets into lots of trouble for not adhering to certain things, like she wants to walk outside of the carrying the actual, there's this idea that if you're in a chair, you are in a chair and all your curtains are closed. So you're not polluting that bit of landscape you're traveling through. You're nothing to do with it. And you're in this traveling sort of thing. And those ideas persisted in a sort of strange sort of way in very rural areas, you know, and she wanted to take pictures with a camera and she wanted to get out of the chair. And then they would get attacked because she'd be walking along and things like that would happen to her. Yeah, I haven't explained that very well, but there was the big change is when the Suez Canal opens up. And suddenly people could get to China quite with greater ease than they had before. Yeah.
Photographs, very interesting. Did he write any social commentary as we describe it? For example, pigtails, bound feet, the opium epidemic?
When you read him, it's obviously it's a person of that particular time, but he writes with more compassion. He takes pictures of the bound feet and normal feet and explains that it's a tradition that doesn't happen across all over China. It's only in certain parts of China. It can be quite distressing when you're reading it, and he does refer to this thing about everybody calls their servants boys when they're elderly men. You know, it's quite offensive, really, isn't it?
Where can you read this?
So the books, you can get these books online. So the book that I had, The Straits of Monarch, you can look at that online, and you can get a copy up online. And the illustrations of China and its people is online. So you can actually read the pages and go through it. Yeah, just have a little look. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
Any more questions? Would somebody kind of pass the instrument?
Thank you. You tell us that John Thomson had an interest in sharing Chinese culture with UK. Did it go the other way around? When he went to China, did he take slides with him of Scotland and showed them to the Chinese?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think there isn't any evidence that he did that. Yeah, and it's quite strange. And when I was at the RPS, the thing that everybody was interested in him for was his street life of London, you know, and the images he took of the poor of London. But it's a very strange thing because there's poverty in both places, you know, or that, you know, he doesn't seem to have taken anything. Now, to answer your question properly, I don't think he did. There's no evidence of that.
I'm trying to speak loudly. Why did they dislike us so much? Because you sort of said...
Oh, well, it's because of the opium, and yeah, it's also to do with, there's one particular war, a civil war sort of that takes place, so it's about Jesus Christ. There's a Chinese person that says, I am the new Jesus. And it's associated, the destruction that happens with that is associated with the Europeans. It's because of the forcing of the treaty ports to be there when they don't want the treaty ports there. But they managed to contain the Europeans to the coast most of the time. But it's like, you know, they've lived this life, and it's completely different way of looking at the world. It's like Isabella Bird said, you know, why is it when something falls down, why don't you rebuild it? And they sort of said, well, actually we don't, because we don't need to rebuild it. Why do we need to rebuild it? Do we need that? If we need a new one, we'll make a new one, but we don't need that anymore. So we're just letting that, it's just going to go into the earth. It's a sort of, they just were, they couldn't understand Isabella Bird when a lot of them went, and people would turn up to look at her. Women would turn up at mission, that she would travel through different mission stations, and people would turn up to look at her. The ladies of the place would turn up to look at her, have a good laugh. And they would think she was absolutely alien and strange, and she would try and find out from them why they wore their clothes like this. And it's just, yeah, we were very unpopular because we made them do things they didn't want to do, really, as well, I suppose. Right.
Nothing much has changed, has it? I'm reminded that Ansel Adams used to work with even larger glass plates, but he had a mule. I can't remember what his mule was called, but he took these huge cameras up mountains in the States.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's fascinating. And I'm an absolutely useless photographer, so I ask a very stupid question. A lot of those photographs have very clear images of people in them, and those people wouldn't have understood photography at all. And I just wonder if he describes how he managed to get them so still. I imagine, I don't know what the exposure times were, but I imagine they were a few seconds or something like that.
Well, in the, it's quite interesting, in the book about Scottish photography, there's this idea that the Scots knew something that nobody else did on how to do fast exposures. But I don't know whether that's true or not. That's what Sarah Stevenson wrote. But I think actually, they look as though they are relaxed with him. And I think he probably got them just to stay, he managed to communicate that they have to stay still. And he managed to do it in such a way. I mean, he definitely had a way with people, I think.
That's one of the skills he absolutely had, how to get such clear images.
Yeah. And not get attacked too often. Yeah. So.
Are we at an end?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
You haven't advertised your...
Oh yeah, I meant to say this is what this is all about. I forgot that. I started looking at the negatives because I was asked to go on this tour, to lead a tour to China. And I mean, it's crazy, really, because we're going to go to these places that he was at, and these are now super cities, really. But I started looking at the negatives, because I thought, well, it'd be really interesting, I'll just go back and have a look. But what I found was that there was a lot more to be found in the negatives than I thought. So that's when I found the image of the equipment and things like that. But if it's a tour that's taking place in October, if anybody's interested, it's with John Baines, and it goes from the 11th to the 26th of October, and we're following in his footsteps up the coast to Peking. Yeah. No, fast train, I think. Some of it is by, but I think majority of it is by. There's some flying and there's a fast trains, I think. No, this is going to be fantastic. It's going to be quite something.
Do you still see people wearing clothes like that out of the cities?
No, I don't think so.
Now,
I don't think so.
without in the country.
No, I don't think so, because of the Cultural Revolution changed everything. Yeah.
Can I just ask about the fact he said it's mentioned that he was an optician.
Yeah.
So did he do any selling of photography or
What his knowledge about optics really meant that he was really good with lenses and his cameras and things like that. But he was really a photographer when he went there. But I suppose that, you know, when he was in the Straits, when he was in Singapore, first of all, he was supposed to be working with his brother, who was a watchmaker, I think, wasn't he? But I think photography was his thing. But you would have learnt how to make spectacles and things like that, lenses and things like that, but photography was what he was about.
So did he speak the local language? How did he communicate?
Yeah, well, I think he did, because I think he was very good at languages, and this is back to how do you communicate with people to stay still. When he goes back the first time and meets the love of his life, when he's intending to stay in Edinburgh, he campaigns for a job teaching foreign languages in Edinburgh for people who are thinking about going to work in the Far East. And so he's supported in that, and and it appears in the papers and things, and but it all changes when he has to make some money, I think.